Cavendish started on the 6th August, 1591, with 5 vessels, but a storm on the coast of Patagonia scattered the flotilla, which could not be collected again until the arrival at Port Desire. Assailed by fearful hurricanes in the Strait of Magellan, Cavendish was obliged to go back, after having seen himself deserted by 3 of his ships. The want of fresh provisions, the cold, and the privations of all kinds which he underwent, and which had decimated his crew, forced him to return northwards along the coast of Brazil, where the Portuguese opposed every attempt at landing. He was therefore obliged to put to sea again without having been able to revictual. Cavendish died, from grief perhaps as much as from hardships, before he reached the English coast. 1 year after the return of the companions of Barentz, 2 ships, the Mauritius and the Hendrik Frederick, with 2 yachts, the Eendracht and Esperance, having on board a crew of 248 men, quitted Amsterdam on the 2nd July, 1598. The commander-in-chief of this squadron was Oliver de Noort, a man at that time about 30 or thereabouts, and well known as having made several long cruising voyages. His second-in-command and vice-admiral was Jacob Claes Dulpender, and as pilot there was a certain Melis, a skillful sailor of English origin. This expedition, fitted out by the merchants of Amsterdam with the concurrence and aid of the States General of Holland, had a double purpose, at once commercial and military. Formerly, the Dutch had contented themselves with fetching from Portugal the merchandise which they distributed by means of their coasting vessels throughout Europe, but now they were reduced to the necessity of going to seek the commodities in the scene of their production. For this object, de Noort was to show his countrymen the route inaugurated by Magellan, and on the way to inflict as much injury as he could upon the Spaniards and Portuguese. At this period, Philip Roman II, whose yoke the Dutch had shaken off, and who had just added Portugal to his possessions, had forbidden his subjects to have any commercial intercourse with the rebels of the Low Countries. It was thus a necessity for Holland, if she did not wish to be ruined, and as a consequence, to fall anew under Spanish rule, to open up for herself a road to the Spice Islands. The route, which was the least frequented by the enemy's ships, was that by the Strait of Magellan, and this was the one which de Noort was ordered to follow. After touching at Goree, the Dutch anchored in the Gulf of Guinea, at the island du Principe. Here the Portuguese pretended to give a friendly welcome to the men who went on shore, but they took advantage of a favorable opportunity to fall upon and massacre them without mercy. Among the dead were Cornel de Noort, brother of the Admiral Melis, Daniel Goeritz, and John de Bremen, the captain, Peter Eges, being the only man who escaped. It was a sorrowful commencement for a campaign, a sad presage which was destined not to remain unfulfilled. De Noort, who was furious over this foul play, landed from his ships 120 men, but he found the Portuguese so well entrenched that after a brisk skirmish in which 17 more of his men were either killed or wounded, he was obliged to weigh anchor without having been able to avenge the wicked and cowardly perfidy to which his brother and 12 of his companions had fallen victims. On the 25th December, one of the pilots named Jan Valkers was abandoned on the African coast as a punishment for his disloyal intrigues, for endeavoring to foment a spirit of despondency amongst the crews, and for his well-proved rebellion. On the 5th January, the island of Annobon, situated in the Gulf of Guinea, a little below the line, was sighted, and the course of the ships was changed for crossing the Atlantic. De Noort had scarcely cast anchor in the Bay of Rio Janeiro before he sent some sailors on shore to obtain water and buy provisions from the natives, but the Portuguese opposed the landing and killed 11 men. Afterwards, repulsed from the coast of Brazil by the Portuguese and the natives, driven back by contrary winds, having made vain efforts to reach the island of St. Helena, where they had hoped to obtain the provisions of which they were in the most pressing want, the Dutchmen, deprived of their pilot, toss at random upon the ocean. They land upon the desert islands of Martin Vaz, again reach the coast of Brazil at Rio dos, which they mistake for Ascension Island, and are finally obliged to winter in the desert island of Santa Clara. The putting into port at this place was marked by several disagreeable events. The flagship struck upon a rock with so much violence that had the sea been a little rougher, she must have been lost. There were also some bloody and barbarous executions of mutinous sailors, notably that of a poor man who, having wounded a pilot with a knife thrust, was condemned to have his hand nailed to the mainmast. The invalids, of whom there were many on board the fleet, were brought on shore, and nearly all were cured by the end of a fortnight. From the 2nd to the 21st of June, De Noort remained in this island, which was not more than 3 miles from the mainland. But before putting to sea, he was obliged to burn the Eendracht, as he had not sufficient men to work her. It was not until the 20th December, after having been tried by many storms, that he was able to cast anchor in Port Desire, where the crew killed in a few days a quantity of dogfish and sea lions, as well as more than 5,000 penguins. The general landed, says the French translation of De Noort's narrative, published by de Bry, with a party of armed men, but they saw nobody, only some graves placed on high situations among the rocks, in which the people bury their dead, putting upon the grave a great quantity of stones, all painted red, having besides adorned the graves with darts, plumes of feathers, and other singular articles which they use as arms. A sea lion hunt. A sea lion hunt. From an old print. The Dutch saw also, but at too great a distance to shoot them, buffaloes, stags, and ostriches, and from a single nest they obtained 10 ostrich eggs. Captain Jacob Jantz Heide Cooper died during the stay at this place and was interred at Port Desire. On the 23rd November, the fleet entered the Strait of Magellan. During a visit to the shore, 3 Dutchmen were killed by some Patagonians, and their death was avenged by the massacre of a whole tribe of Inus. The long navigation through the narrows and the lakes of the Strait of Magellan was signalized by the meeting with 2 Dutch ships, under the command of Sebald de Weert, who had wintered not far from the Bay of Mauritius, and by the abandoning of Vice Admiral Claes, who, as it would appear, had been several times guilty of insubordination. Are not these acts, which we see so frequently committed by English, Dutch, and Spanish navigators, a true sign of the times? A deed which we should regard nowadays as one of terrible barbarity seemed, doubtless, a relatively mild punishment in the eyes of men so accustomed to set but little value upon human life. Nevertheless, could anything be more cruel than to abandon a man in a desert country, without arms and without provisions, to put him on shore in a country peopled by ferocious cannibals, prepared to make a repast on his flesh? What was it but condemning him to a horrible death? On the 29th of February, 1600, De Noort, after having been 99 days in passing through the strait, came out on to the Pacific Ocean. A fortnight later, a storm separated him from the Hendrik Frederick, which was never again heard of. As for De Noort, who had now with him only 1 yacht besides his own vessel, he cast anchor at the island of Mocha, and unlike the experience of his predecessors, he was very well received by the natives. Afterwards he sailed along the coast of Chile, where he was able to obtain provisions in abundance in exchange for Nuremberg knives, hatchets, shirts, hats, and other articles of no great value. After ravaging, plundering, and burning several towns on the Peruvian coast, after sinking all the vessels that he met with, and amassing a considerable booty, De Noort, hearing that a squadron commanded by the brother of the viceroy, Don Luis de Velasco, had been sent in pursuit of him, judged it time to make for the Ladrone Islands, where he anchored on the 16th of September. The inhabitants came around our ship with more than 200 canoes, there being 3, 4, or 5 men in each canoe, crying out all together, "Hiero, hiero, iron, iron," which is greatly in request amongst them. They are as much at home in the water as upon land, and are very clever divers, as we perceived when we threw 5 pieces of iron into the sea, which a single man went to search for. De Noort could testify, unfortunately, that these islands well deserved their name. The islanders tried even to drag the nails out of the ship, and carried off everything upon which they could lay their hands. One of them, having succeeded in climbing along a part of the rigging, had the audacity to enter a cabin and seize upon a sword, with which he threw himself into the sea. On the 14th October following, De Noort traversed the Philippine archipelago, where he made several descents, and burnt, plundered, or sunk a number of Spanish or Portuguese vessels and some Chinese junks. While cruising in the Strait of Manila, he was attacked by 2 large Spanish vessels, and in the battle which followed the Dutch had 5 men killed, and 25 wounded, and lost their brigantine, which was captured with her crew of 25 men. The Spaniards lost more than 200 men, for their flagship caught fire and sank. Far from picking up the wounded and the able-bodied men who were trying to save themselves by swimming, the Dutch, making way with sails set on the foremast, across the heads which were to be seen in the water, pierced some with lances, and also discharged their cannon over them. After this bloody and fruitless victory, de Noort went to recruit at Borneo, captured a rich cargo of spices at Java, and having doubled the Cape of Good Hope, landed at Rotterdam on the 26th of August, having only one ship and 48 men remaining. If the merchants who had defrayed the expenses of the expedition approved of the conduct of de Noort, who brought back a cargo which more than reimbursed them for their expenditure, and who had taught his countrymen the way to the Indies, it behoves us, while extolling his qualities as a sailor, to take great exception to the manner in which he exercised the command, and to mete out severe blame for the barbarity which has left a stain of blood upon the first Dutch voyage of circumnavigation. Battle of Manila. Battle of Manila. From an old print. We have now to speak of a man who, endowed with eminent qualities and with at least equal defects, carried on his life's work in divers, sometimes even in opposing directions, and who, after having reached the highest summit of honor to which a gentleman could aspire, at last laid his head upon a scaffold, accused of treason and felony. This man is Sir Walter Raleigh. If he have any claim to a place in this portrait gallery of great sailors, it is neither as founder of any English colony nor as a sailor. It is as a discoverer, and what we have to say of him is not to his credit. Walter Raleigh passed 5 years in France fighting against the League, in the midst of all those Gascons who formed the basis of the armies of Henry of Navarre, and in such society he perfected the habits of boasting and falsehood which belonged to his character. In 1577, after a campaign in the Low Countries against the Spaniards, he returns to England and takes a deep interest in the questions so passionately debated among his 3 brothers by the mother's side, John, Humphrey, and Adrian Gilbert. At this period, England was passing through a very grave economic crisis. The practice of agriculture was undergoing a transformation. In all directions, grazing was being substituted for tillage, and the number of agricultural laborers was greatly reduced by the change. From thence arose general distress, and also such a surplusage of population as was fast becoming a matter of anxious concern. At the same time, to long wars succeeds a peace, destined to endure throughout the reign of Elizabeth, so that a great number of adventurers know not how to find indulgence for their love of violent emotions. At this moment, therefore, arises the necessity for such an emigration as may relieve the country of its population, may permit all the miserable people dying of hunger to provide for their own wants in a new country, and by that means may increase the influence and prosperity of the mother country. All the more thoughtful minds in England, who follow the course of public opinion, Hakluyt, Thomas Harriot, Carlyle, Peckham, and the brothers Gilbert, are struck with this need. But it is to the last named that belongs the credit of indicating the locality suitable for the establishing of colonies. Raleigh only joined with his brothers in the scheme, following their lead, but he neither conceived nor began the carrying into execution, as he has been too often credited with doing, of this fruitful project, the colonization of the American shores of the Atlantic. If Raleigh, all-powerful with Queen Elizabeth, fickle, and nevertheless jealous in her affections as she was, encourage his brothers, if he expend himself 40,000 sterling in his attempts at colonization, he still takes good care not to quit England, for the life of patience and self-devotion of the founder of a colony would have no attractions for him. He gives up and sells his patent as soon as he perceives the inutility of his efforts, while he does not forget to reserve for himself the 5th part of any profit arising eventually from the colony. Sir Walter Raleigh. Sir Walter Raleigh. From an old print. At the same time, Raleigh fits out some vessels against the Spanish possessions, and himself soon takes part in the strife and the battles which saved England from the invincible Armada, afterwards proceeding to support the claims of the Prior de Crato to the throne of Portugal. It is a short time after his return to England that he falls into disgrace with his royal mistress, and after his release from prison, while he is confined to his princely mansion of Sherborne, he conceives the project of his voyage to Guiana. To his mind, this is a gigantic enterprise of which the marvelous results are destined to draw upon him the attention of the whole world, and to restore to him the favor of his sovereign. Would not the discovery and conquest of El Dorado, of the country in which, according to Orellana, the temples are roofed with plates of gold, where all the tools, even those for the meanest purposes, are made of gold, where one walks upon precious stones, procure for him greater glory? These are the very words which Raleigh employs in his account, than Cortes had gained in Mexico or Pizarro in Peru. He will have under him more golden towns and nations than the King of Spain, the Sultan of the Turks, and no matter what emperor. We have already spoken of the fables which Orellana had invented in 1539, and which had been the fruitful source of more than one legend. Humboldt discloses what had given them birth when he describes to us the nature of the soil and the rocks which surround Lake Parima, between the Essequibo and the Branco. They are, says this great traveler, rocks of micaceous slate and of sparkling talc, which are resplendent in the midst of a sheet of water, which acts as a reflector beneath the burning tropical sun. So are explained those massive domes of gold, those obelisks of silver, and all those marvels of which the boastful and enthusiastic minds of the Spaniards afforded them a glimpse. Did Raleigh believe really in the existence of this city of gold, for the conquest of which he was about to sacrifice so many lives? Was he thoroughly convinced himself, or did he not yield to the illusions of a mind eager for glory? It is impossible to say, but this at least is indisputable, that, to borrow the just expressions of M. Philaret Chasles, at the moment even of his embarkation, men did not believe in his promises. They were suspicious of his exaggerations, and dreaded the results of an expedition directed by a man so foolhardy and of a morality so equivocal. Raleigh seizes Berreo. Raleigh seizes Berreo. From an old print. Nevertheless, it seemed that Raleigh had foreseen everything needful for this undertaking, and that he had made the necessary studies. Not only did he speak of the nature of the soil of Guiana, of its productions, and its inhabitants with imperturbable assurance, but he had taken care to send, at his own expense, a ship commanded by Captain Whiddon, to prepare the way for the fleet, which he intended to conduct in person to the banks of the Orinoco. What he took good care, however, not to confide to the public, was that all the information he received from his emissary was unfavorable to the enterprise. Raleigh himself started from Plymouth on the 9th February, 1595, with a small fleet of 5 vessels and soldiers, without reckoning marines, officers, and volunteers. After stopping 4 days at Forteventura, one of the Canaries, to take in wood and water there, he reached Tenerife, where Captain Brereton ought to have rejoined him. Having waited for him in vain for 80 days, Raleigh sailed for Trinidad, where he met Whiddon. The island of Trinidad was at that time governed by Don Antonio de Berreo, who, it is said, had obtained accurate information concerning Guiana. The arrival of the English did not please him, and he immediately dispatched emissaries to Cumana and to Margarita, with orders to gather together the troops to attack the Englishmen, while at the same time he forbade any Indians or Spaniards to hold intercourse with them under pain of death. Raleigh, forewarned, determined to be beforehand with him. At nightfall he landed in secret with 100 men, captured the town of St. Joseph, to which the Indians set fire without a blow, and carried off Berreo and the principal personages to the ships. At the same time arrived Captains Gifford and Ninan, from whom he had been separated upon the Spanish coasts. Raleigh at once sailed for the Orinoco, entered Capuri Bay with a large galley and 3 boats carrying 100 sailors and soldiers, became entangled in the inextricable labyrinth of islands and canals which formed the mouth of the river, and ascended the Orinoco for a distance of 330 miles. The account which Raleigh gives of his campaign is so fabulous. With the coolness of a Gascon transported to the banks of the Thames, he so heaps one falsehood upon the top of another, that one is almost tempted to class his narrative amongst the number of imaginary voyages. He says that some Spaniards who had seen the town of Manoa, called El Dorado, told him that this town exceeds in size and wealth all the towns in the world, and everything which the conquistadores had seen in America. There is no winter there, he says, a soil dry and fertile, with game and birds of every species in great abundance, who filled the air with hitherto unknown notes. It was a real concert for us. My captain, sent to search for mines, perceived veins both of gold and silver, but as he had no tool but his sword, he was unable to detach these metals to examine them in detail. However, he carried away several bits of them, which he reserved for future examination. A Spaniard of Caracas called this mine Madre del Oro, Mother of Gold. Then, as Raleigh well knows that the public is on its guard against his exaggerations, he adds, "It will be thought perchance that I am the sport of a false and cheating delusion, but why should I have undertaken a voyage thus laborious, if I had not entertained the conviction that there is not a country upon earth which is richer in gold than Guiana?" Whiddon and Malchap, our surgeon, brought back several stones which resembled sapphires. I showed these stones to several inhabitants of Orinoco, who have assured me that there exists an entire mountain of them. An old cacique of the age of 110, who nevertheless could still walk 10 miles without fatigue, came to see Raleigh, boasted to him of the formidable power of the Emperor of Manoa, and proved to him that his forces were insufficient. He depicted these people as much civilized, as wearing clothes, and possessing great riches, especially in plates of gold. Finally, he spoke to him of a mountain of pure gold. Raleigh relates that he wished to approach this mountain, but sad mischance, it was at that moment half submerged. It had the form of a tower, and appeared to me rather white than yellow. A torrent which precipitated itself from the mountain, swollen by the rains, made a tremendous noise, which could be heard at the distance of many miles, and which deafened our people. I recollected the description which Berriow had given of the brilliancy of the diamonds and of the other precious stones scattered over the various parts of the country. I had, however, some doubt as to the value of these stones. Their extraordinary whiteness nevertheless surprised me. After a short time of repose on the banks of the Vinicapara and a visit to the village of the cacique, the latter promised to conduct me to the foot of the mountain by a circuitous route. But at the sight of the numerous difficulties which presented themselves, I preferred to return to the mouth of the Cumana, where the caciques of the neighborhood came to bring various presents, consisting of the rare productions of the country. We will spare the reader the description of people 3 times taller than ordinary men, of cyclops, of natives who had their eyes upon the shoulders, their mouth in the chest, and the hair growing from the middle of the back, all affirmations seriously related, but which give to Raleigh's narrative a singular resemblance to a fairy tale. One fancies, while reading it, that it must be a page taken out of the 1001 Nights. If we put on one side all these figments of an imagination run mad, what gain has been derived for geography? There was certainly no pains spared in announcing with much noise, and very great puffing, this fantastic expedition, and we may well say with the fable writer, "In fancy free, I an author see, who says, the awful war I'll sing, of Titans with the Thunder King. Of this grand promise the result, we find, is often wind." Chapter 5. Missionaries and Settlers, Merchants and Tourists. 1. Distinguishing characteristics of the 17th century, the more thorough exploration of regions previously discovered. To the thirst for gold succeeds apostolic zeal. Italian missionaries in Congo, Portuguese missionaries in Abyssinia, Brew in Senegal and Flacourt in Madagascar, the apostles of India, of Indochina, and of Japan. The 17th century has a distinctive character of its own, differing from that of the preceding century in the fact that nearly all the great discoveries have been already made, and that the work of this whole period consists almost exclusively in perfecting the information already acquired. It contrasts equally with the century which is to succeed it, because scientific methods are not yet applied by astronomers and sailors, as they are to be 100 years later. It appears, in fact, that the narratives of the first explorers, who were only able, so to speak, to obtain a glimpse of the regions which they traversed while waging their wars, may have in some degree exercised a baneful influence upon the public mind. Curiosity, in the narrowest sense of the word, is carried to an extreme. Men travel over the world to gain an idea of the manners and customs of each nation, of the productions and manufactures of each country, but there is no real study. They do not seek to trace what they see to its source and to reason scientifically upon the why and wherefore of facts. They behold, curiosity is satisfied, and they pass on. The observations made do not penetrate beneath the surface, and the great object appears to be to visit, as rapidly as may be, all the regions which the 16th century has brought to light. Besides, the abundance of the wealth diffused on a sudden over the whole of Europe has caused an economic crisis. Commerce, like industry, is transformed and altered. New ways are opened, new mediums arise, new wants are created, luxury increases, and the eagerness to make a fortune rapidly by speculation turns the heads of many. If Venice from a commercial point of view be dead, the Dutch are about to constitute themselves, to use a happy expression of M. Beaulieu, the carriers and agents of Europe, and the English are preparing to lay the foundations of their vast colonial empire. To the merchants succeed the missionaries. They alight in large numbers upon the newly discovered countries, preaching the gospel, civilizing the barbarous nations, studying and describing the country. The development of apostolic zeal is one of the dominant features of the 17th century, and it behoves us to recognize all that geography and historic science owe to these devoted, learned, and unassuming men. The traveler only passes through a country, the missionary dwells in it. The latter has evidently much greater facilities for acquiring an intimate knowledge of the history and civilization of the nations which he studies. It is therefore very natural that we should owe to them narratives of journeys, descriptions, and histories, which are still consulted with advantage, and which have served as a basis for later works. If there be any country to which these reflections more particularly apply, it is to Africa, and especially to Abyssinia. How much of this vast triangular continent of Africa was known in the 17th century? Nothing but the coasts, it will be said. A mistake. From the earliest times, the two branches of the Nile, the Astapus and the Bahr el Abiad, had been known to the ancients. They had even advanced, if the lists of countries and nations discovered at Karnak by M. Mariette may be believed, as far as the Great Lakes of the interior. In the 12th century, the Arab geographer Edrisi writes an excellent description of Africa for Roger Roman II, of Sicily, and confirms these data. Later on, Cadamosto and Ibn Battuta travel over Africa, and the latter goes as far as Timbuktu. Marco Polo affirms that Africa is only united to Asia by the Isthmus of Suez, and he visits Madagascar. Lastly, when the Portuguese, led by Vasco da Gama, have completed the circumnavigation of Africa, some of them remain in Abyssinia, and in a short time, diplomatic relations are established between that country and Portugal. We have already said something of Francesco Alvarez. In his train, several Portuguese missionaries settle in the country, amongst whom must be named Fathers Pease and Lobo. Father Pease left Goa in 1588 to preach Christianity upon the eastern coast of North Africa. After long and sad mishaps, he landed at Maswa in Abyssinia, traversed the country, and in 1618 pushed on as far as the sources of the Blue Nile, a discovery the authenticity of which Bruce was hereafter to dispute, but of which the narrative differs only in some unimportant particulars from that of the Scotch traveller. In 1604, Pease, arrived at the court of the King Zardenghul, had preached with such success that he had converted the king and all his court. He had even soon acquired so great an influence over the Abyssinian monarch that the latter, in writing to the Pope and to the King of Spain to offer them his friendship, asked them to send him men fitted to teach his people. Father Geronimo Lobo landed in Abyssinia with Alfonso Menezes, Patriarch of Ethiopia, in 1625. But times were greatly changed. The king converted by Pease had been murdered, and his successor, who had summoned the Portuguese missionaries, died after a short time. A violent revulsion of feeling ensued against the Christians, and the missionaries were driven away, imprisoned, or given up to the Turks. Lobo was charged with the mission of obtaining the sum necessary for the ransom of his companions. After many wanderings, which led him to Brazil, Carthagena, Cadiz, and Seville, to Lisbon and to Rome, where he gave the Pope and the King of Spain numerous and accurate details upon the Church of Ethiopia and the manners of the inhabitants, he made a last journey in India and returned to Lisbon to die in 1678. Christianity had been introduced into Congo upon the Atlantic coast in 1489, the year of its discovery by the Portuguese. At first Dominicans were sent, but as they made scarce any progress, the Pope, with the consent of the King of Portugal, dispatched thither some Italian Capuchins. These were Carli de Placenza in 1667, Giovanni Antonio Cavazzi, fro to 1668, afterwards Antonio Zucchelli and Gradisca, fro to 1704. We shall mention these missionaries only because they have published accounts of their journeys. Cavazzi explored in succession Angola, the country of Matumba, and the islands of Konza and Lona. In the ardor of his apostolic zeal, he could devise no better means of converting the blacks than by burning their idols, rebuking the kings for the time-honored custom of polygamy, and subjecting to torture, or to being torn with whips, those who relapsed into idolatry. Notwithstanding all this, he gained considerable ascendancy over the natives, which, if it had been well directed, might have produced very useful results in the development of civilization and the progress of religion. The same reproach is due also to Father Zucchelli and to the other missionaries in Congo. The narrative of Cavazzi, published at Rome in 1687, asserted that Portuguese influence extended fro to 300 miles from the coast, and that in the interior there existed a very important town, known by the name of San Salvador, which possessed 12 churches, a Jesuit college, and a population of 50,000 souls. At the close of the 14th century, Pigafetta published the account of the journey of Duarte Lopez, ambassador from the King of Congo to the courts of Rome and Lisbon. A map which accompanies this narrative presents to us a Lake Zamba, in the very place occupied by Lake Tanganyika, and more to the west, Lake Ekwelunda, from whence issued the Congo River. South of the equator, two lakes are indicated, one the Lake of the Nile, the other, more to the east, bears the name of Kalu. They appear to be the Albert and the Victoria Nyanza. This most curious information was rejected by the geographers of the 19th century, who left blank the whole interior of Africa. Upon the west coast of Africa, at the mouth of the Senegal, the French had established settlements which, under the skillful administration of Andrew Brew, speedily received considerable extension. Brew, commandant for the King and Director General of the Royal French Company upon the Senegal coast and in other parts of Africa, so ran his official title, although he may be little known, and the article which treats of him may be one of the most curtailed in the great collections of biography, deserves to occupy one of the most prominent positions among colonizers and explorers. Not content with extending the colony as far as its present limits, he explored countries which have been only lately revisited by Lieutenant Mage, or which have not been visited at all since Brew's time. He carried the French outposts eastwards above the junction of the Senegal and the Falim, northwards as far as Arguin, which we have since abandoned, although reserving our rights, and southwards as far as the island of Bissau. He explored in the interior Galim and Bambouk, so rich in gold, and collected the earliest documents concerning the Pauls, Pules, or Fowls, the Yalofs and the Mussulman, who, coming from the north, attempted the religious conquest of all the black nations of the country. The information thus collected by Brew about the history and migrations of these various people is of the greatest value, affording clear light, even in the present day, to the geographer and the historian. Not only has Brew left us the narrative of deeds of which he was witness and the description of the places which he visited, but we also owe to him much information about the productions of the countries, the plants, the animals, and all the objects which would give occasion for commercial or industrial enterprise. These most curious documents, put together very maladroitly it must be confessed, by Father Labat, formed the subject, a few years ago, of a very interesting work by M. Burlew. To the southeast of Africa, during the first half of the 17th century, the French founded some commercial settlements in Madagascar, an island long known under the name of St. Lawrence. They build Fort Dauphin under the administration of M. de Flacourt. Several unknown districts of the island are explored as well as the neighboring islands upon the coast. The Mascarenes Islands are occupied in 1649. Although firm and moderate towards his countrymen, de Flacourt did not use the same self-control towards the natives. He even brought about a general revolt, as a consequence of which he was recalled. Expeditions into the interior of Madagascar were henceforth very rare, and it is not until the present day that we find a thorough exploration carried out. Of Indochina and Thibet, the only information which reached Europe during the whole of the 17th century was due to the missionaries. Such names as Father Alexander de Rhodes, Ant, D'Andrada, Avril, Benedict Goes may not be passed over in silence. In their annual letters is to be found a quantity of information, which even in the present day retains a real interest, as concerning regions so long closed against Europeans. In Cochin China and Tonkin, Father Tackard devoted himself to astronomical observations, of which the result was to prove by the most conclusive evidence the great errors in the longitudes given by Ptolemy. This called the attention of the learned world to the necessity of a reform in the graphic representation of the countries of the extreme East, and for attaining this end, to the absolute need of close observations made by specially qualified scientific men, or by navigators familiar with astronomical calculations. The country which especially attracted the missionaries was China, that enormous and populous empire, which ever since the arrival of Europeans in India had persevered with the greatest strictness in the absurd policy of abstention from any intercourse whatsoever with foreigners. It was not until the close of the 16th century that the missionaries obtained the permission, so often demanded before in vain, to penetrate into the Middle Empire. Their knowledge of mathematics and astronomy facilitated their settlement and enabled them to gather, as well from the ancient annals of the country as during their journeys, a prodigious quantity of most valuable information concerning the history, ethnography, and geography of the Celestial Empire. Fathers Mendoza, Rixay, Trigault, Vistalou, Lecomte, Verbiest, Navarrete, Scholl, and Martini deserve a special mention for having carried to China the arts and sciences of Europe, while they diffused in the West the first accurate and precise information upon the unprogressive civilization of the Flowery Land. Chapter 2. Missionaries and Settlers, Merchants and Tourists. The Dutch in the Spice Islands, Le Maire and Schouten, Tasman, Mendana, Queros and Tours, Pirard de Laval, Pietro della Val Tavernier, the Venot Bernier, Robert Knox Chardin, de Bruyne K. Ampfer. The Dutch were not slow in perceiving the weakness and decadence of the Portuguese power in Asia. They felt with how much ease a clever and prudent nation might in a short time become possessed of the whole commerce of the extreme East. After a considerable number of private expeditions and voyages of reconnaissance, they had founded in 1602 that celebrated Company of the Indies, which was destined to raise to so high a pitch the wealth and prosperity of the metropolis. Equally in its strife with the Portuguese as in its dealing with the natives, the company pursued a very skillful policy of moderation. Far from founding colonies or repairing and occupying the fortresses which they took from the Portuguese, the Dutch bore themselves as simple traders, exclusively occupied with their commerce. They avoided building any fortified factory, except at the intersection of the great commercial roads. Thus they were able in a short time to seize all the carrying trade between India, China, Japan, and Oceania. The one fault committed by the all-powerful company was the concentrating in its own hands a monopoly of the trade in spices. It drove away the foreigners who had settled in the Moluccas or in the islands of Sunda, or who came thither to obtain a cargo of spices. It even went the length, in order to raise the price of this valuable commodity, of prescribing the cultivation of certain species in a large number of islands and of forbidding, under pain of death, the exportation and sale of seeds and cuttings of the spice-producing trees. In a few years, the Dutch were established in Java, Sumatra, Borneo, the Moluccas, and at the Cape of Good Hope, harbors the best placed for ships returning to Europe. It was at this time that a rich merchant of Amsterdam, Jacob Le Maire, in concert with a skillful mariner named Wilhelm Cornelis Schouten, conceived a project for reaching the Indies by a new route. The Dutch States General had in fact forbidden any subject of the United Provinces, not in the pay of the Company of the Indies, from going to the Spice Islands by way of the Cape of Good Hope or of the Strait of Magellan. Schouten, according to some, Le Maire, according to others, had formed the idea of eluding this interdict by seeking a passage to the south of Magellan's Strait. This much is certain, that Le Maire bore one half of the expense of the expedition, while Schouten, by the aid of several merchants whose names have been handed down to us, and who filled the chief offices in the town of Horn, provided the other half. They fitted out the Concorde, a vessel of 360 tons, and a yacht, carrying together a crew of 65 men and 29 cannon. This was certainly an equipment, but little in accordance with the magnitude of the enterprise. But Schouten was a skillful mariner, the crew had been carefully chosen, and the vessels were abundantly furnished with provisions and spare rigging. Le Maire was commissioner, and Schouten the captain of the ship. The destination was kept secret, and officers and crew entered into an unlimited engagement to go wherever they might be led. On the 25th June, 1615, 11 days after quitting the Texel, and when there was no longer anything to be feared from indiscretion, the crews were assembled to listen to the reading of an order which ran as follows. The two vessels would seek another passage than that of Magellan, by which to enter the South Sea and to discover there certain southern countries, in the hope of obtaining enormous profits from them, and if heaven should not favor this design, they would repair by means of the same sea to the East Indies. This declaration was received with enthusiasm by the whole crew, who were animated, like all Dutchmen of that period, with a love for great discoveries. The route then usually pursued for reaching South America, as may perhaps have been already observed, followed the African coasts as far as below the equator. The Concorde did not try to deviate from it. She reached the shores of Brazil, Patagonia, and Port Desire, at 300 miles to the north of the Strait of Magellan, but was for several days hindered by storms from entering the harbor. The yacht even remained for the space of one whole tide, aground and lying on her side, but high water set her afloat again, only for a short time, however, for whilst some repairs were being done to her keel, her rigging took fire, and she was consumed in spite of the energetic efforts of the two crews. On the 13th January, 1616, Le Maire and Schouten arrived at the Sebaldine Islands, discovered by Sebald de Weert, and followed the coast of Tierra del Fuego at a short distance from land. The coast ran east-quarter-southeast and was skirted by high mountains covered with snow. On the 24th of January at midday, they sighted its extreme point, but eastward stretched some more land, which also appeared to be of great elevation. The distance between these two islands, according to the general opinion, appeared to be about 24 miles, and Schouten entered the strait which divided them. It was so encumbered with whales that the ship was obliged to tack more than once to avoid them. The island to the east received the name of Staten Island, and that to the west the name of Maurice of Nassau. The sea was so encumbered with whales. The sea was so encumbered with whales